This is going to be one of the most challenging stones that I've ever cut. It's a 1740 carat Morganite, and as you can see, it starts out as a carving with some very large inclusions inside. Now my goal here is to slice off the front of the carving and then slice across these crack lines and try to get the biggest stone that's left over. So the first step in accomplishing this is sawing off that carving, which is easier said than done because the stone is much bigger than my saw blade, which means I have to cut it from 4 different sides and try to get around the whole piece. And eventually I do. I break 2 saw blades in the process, but I do get it off. And once I've got that carving off, I'm now working on what's left. I've chopped off the extra bits at the bottom. I've sliced along the inclusion lines, and I'm now preforming very roughly. I'm taking off the deepest results of the carving, and eventually I move over to my faceting machine where I continue to preform, and I am working on the shape, making something that's nice, making something that's balanced, and also utilizes the biggest possible potential of what's left of this 1700 carat stone. So this whole preforming process takes more than an hour. I'm working on the table, I'm working on the balance of the left and the right, I'm working on the harmony of the outline of the stone. And if I don't get this right, no matter what I do as far as the faceting and the pattern, it's not going to look harmonious. So I've got to really examine this, and I've got to be in love with this before I can move on. And you can see what's come out of this process. I've got a 313 carat egg-shaped preform. Now the color looks nice, the color looks soft, and we can get a hint that there are some inclusions inside here, but it's a big stone and it's a pretty color, so we proceed to the dopping. You can see I've got a very giant dop here. This is actually a dop I've never used for faceting because it's so big. So I'm going to use super glue, and I'm going to attach the dop face to the table side, and I'm actually going to cut pavilion first this time, which is the opposite of my normal procedure. Now normally I start with the crown and create a beautiful front face for the stone and also a very balanced girdle line. But with this stone, because Morganite is such a low RI stone and I've got a very specific pattern in mind, I want to make sure that I can exactly get my pattern and my pavilion down, because Morganite doesn't have a lot of room to play compared to some of the other stones that I work with. Now you can see I've got a nice design that I've planned out, lots of nice reflection, something that's going to really show off the color of this Morganite without blowing out the color. Again, this low RI pastel color, it's really easy to overwhelm it with brightness, with flash, and I don't want to do that. So I'm getting ready to cut here, and I'm setting up my handpiece, making sure that the stone is perfectly aligned with my index gear, so when I start cutting the facets, everything's going to be symmetrical and even left to right. So now I begin the cutting process, and I'm cutting in slowly. This is a really big stone, and each one of the facets takes quite a long time to cut into depth. So here you can see my first couple of facets are just starting to come in, and I have to watch these two and make sure that my left to right balance is even, because it's easy to make a mistake, especially with such a big stone. Even aligning it off center just a little bit will make the whole pavilion feel crooked. So once I've cut in the first 8 mains and I've started to establish a balance, I can see that my left to right system is even and everything's going to be perfectly mirrored. And now I get deep into my cutting process. Cutting, looking, and occasionally looking at the big picture and making sure that the whole stone is coming in evenly. Now I've designed a special pattern for this, and it's something that I haven't worked very much with before, so I'm being very careful. And once I've established the initial facets, I switch to a finer grit lap. This is going to be my 600 grit, where I'm going to make all of the facets to the depth that I need them to be. And I want to make sure that all my meat points are balanced and even and nice and pointed, because moving these facets in the polishing stage is going to be way too much work. It's going to take way too long. So I need perfect meat points from this 600 stage. And here you can see I've got the first tier cut in. They're looking a little bit more shiny than they did in the 100 grit preforming lap. And now I go to work. I'm cutting. I'm occasionally referring back to my computer where the diagram is and adjusting my angles, adjusting my index, and just getting everything placed exactly where it's supposed to be. This whole process takes hours and hours. These facets are huge, and it takes a long time to get them cut in to exactly where they need to be and to get all my lines where they're supposed to be. But once I finally do get all the facets put in, it's time to switch to my final lap. This is a pewter lap that I have set up with 2 different bands of diamond powder. And because the lead pewter is so soft, I have to constantly score it with a razor blade to keep it cutting quickly and polishing well. And since this is such a big stone, I end up having to do this every few facets, which is unusual. Normally I do this every stone once, but this stone really beats up my lap, and I have to keep cutting it in. So I've got my 2 rings set up, and now I need to mix my diamond slurry. So I've got an 8,000 grit and a 60,000 grit polycrystalline diamond that I mix with sewing machine oil, and then I apply it with my finger. So first is going to be the inner ring. This is 60,000 grit. That's going to be my final polish, my final shine for this stone, which is quite a high polishing grit. And then I'm going to set up my outer ring. This is my 8,000 grit pre-polish. And so again, I mix it with sewing machine oil, and I start to dress the outer ring of the lap, just mixing out that slurry and getting it all over the lap so that it's going to be quickly and effectively polishing my stone. So every time I come down, I need to do small tests, and then once I'm happy knowing that I'm exactly on the facet and adjusted exactly where I need to be, I start to polish with the outer ring. And again, this takes a long time. I have to flatten each facet, make sure that all the deep scratches are out, and then move into the inner ring and get everything nice and shiny. And here you can see the first facet's finished. It's a big one, but nice and reflective, shiny, no scratches. And now I just have to go through and polish each one of those facets that I cut before. And again, this process takes hours. I think one side of the stone took more than 12 hours to get to the final polish point. So I have the first tier done now. You can see some big facets here, but I still have some frosty ones that are still at the cutting grit. So I just have to keep polishing. And because this stone's so big, and you can see I don't really have a lot of room in the lap, I've got to play with how I position and where I polish, and eventually I get the whole pavilion done. You can see all the facets are polished here, everything's shining, everything's symmetrical, and I still have quite a bit of room for my crown. So once the pavilion's done, I soak it in acetone overnight, and the dop releases from the super glue, and the super glue dissolves off the stone. And now I can see what I've done, see how the bottom of the stone looks after a nice clean off. So here we can see the pavilion of the stone's completely finished. All the meat points are nice and intersecting, and the polish is very shiny, very transparent. And it's time to flip the stone over and start to work on my crown side. So this side I'm going to do with with wax because I need to be able to set the stone in and manually balance it so to make sure that my table is nice and aligned with the dop and with my lap. So first thing I do, I heat up the stone, I heat up the wax, and I start to build up. This is a really big stone, so I'm going to need quite a lot of wax. So I'm just going to start adding and adding and adding, and eventually I'm going to build a sort of a cradle for the stone to sit in, something that will not break or come undone or shift while I'm cutting or polishing. So I build it up and I build it up, and eventually I get it to the point where it's able to hold the stone and it's strong and supportive. And after that, I'm ready to start cutting the stone. So I put it into the handpiece, I make sure that everything's lined up again, and I start to cut in my first 8 facets. These are my mains. And so what I'm doing here, aside from blocking in these mains, I've got to make sure that my girdle comes in perfectly balanced and perfectly aligned with both the bottom of the stone and simultaneously balancing the table so that everything is harmonious. Before I go too deep into my crown cutting, I need to polish the table. I decided I need to get this done first. This is a big table and I'm going to need a lot of hand power. So I actually decide to take it out of the handpiece and just do the whole table by hand because it's so big. It's very easy for me to feel that it's on the lap polishing. And once that's done, I start to cut in those 8 mains again and figure out what angles I need to use. Now, this is the trickiest part because what I had on the diagram, what my plan originally was, has to change because I don't have as much crown height as I thought I would. So I'm adjusting all of these facets on the fly, and this is really where all of my skills come into play. So here you can see I've cut in my first 8, my table's starting to look framed, my girdle's starting to look balanced, but there's still more to do. I have to play with this quite a lot to figure out exactly which angles are going to work to balance the girdle and give me a table size that I think is not too big and not too small. So like I said, all of my skills as a gem cutter have come into play on this stone. Hand shaping, preforming, dopping a big stone. I'm improvising all of my indexes here, so I'm cutting in the 8 facets of the mains, the 8 star facets, and the 16 break facets, and making everything fit around this unique shape that I've cut specifically for this stone. So as I start to polish, I have to start adjusting all of my angles. Notice I've got gaps in between all of my stars and the breaks. I've got to manually adjust these in. Also notice that the 2 stars here are not the same shape. One's tall and skinny, one's sort of short and fat. So I have to manually cheat, adjust my angle, and get everything balanced and even and centered. So I'm starting to get closer here, but I'm still not there. One's really, really long, one's short, and this isn't going to work. I've got to make sure that they end up as the same size. There's a lot of little adjustments that I need to make, and I've got to make sure I do it perfectly. And here you can see I'm meeting in the middle, and I'm starting to get the length of the stars the same. The right one still needs to get a little bit longer to match the left one. So more adjusting, more tweaking, and all of this is done in polish. So now I've got both of those star facets balanced, and I'm starting to work my way around the stone, making sure that all the stars are nice and pointed and that everything meets around the table with no overlaps and a good balance of left to right. This is the side of the stone that everyone's going to see, so all of the stars need to be harmonious, they need to be balanced, and they need to frame the table perfectly. Otherwise, it's going to look weird and unpleasant and unharmonious, which is exactly what I don't want to do. So lots of testing, lots of adjusting, and just polish, polish, polish. This takes me another 12 hours or so to cut and polish the crown of this stone. And here you can see I'm starting to get really nice meet points. Everything's meeting up. If I've got a little bit of overlap in any area, I'll go back to the main and adjust the angle a little bit to make sure that nothing's overlapping. So now I've got my last 2 that I've got to work on here. They look totally mismatched at this point, but a little bit more adjusting and my experienced eye will really help me to get everything in balance. Here you can see that all the stars are nice and pointed and meeting and even, and it's time to continue on with the rest of the diagram, the rest of the pattern. So I've got to make sure now that all of the breaks come in perfectly. They need to meet the stars, they need to meet each other, and you can see that I'm bouncing around different parts of the lap. I'm starting to really get a feel for this stone and this lap. And here you can see my breaks are starting to come in. Half of them are done, half of them are still frosty, and I've got to keep dressing the lap, keep scoring it, because this big stone's really wearing in. All of the adjustments are happening by my eye. There's no meters or dials helping me do this. I'm just cutting a little bit, looking at the stone, cutting a little bit more in the pre-polish, and just doing lots and lots of little adjustments. And here you can see I'm working on the last one. Notice the greasy outline. That gray stripe along the left side is allowing me to see exactly how I'm making my final adjustments and getting all of the stars nice and pointed. And so my final step here is going to be to polish the girdle. So I start out by polishing it on my pewter lap and really getting all of the 600 grit skin off. And then the final step is on the felt lap. It gives it a nice glossy finish that I do completely by hand. I'm going around and around and just making sure that there's no pits, no scratches, or no skin left over. And when I'm happy with the girdle, it's time to take the whole thing off the dop and see how I've done. So I'm going to heat up the wax and start to pull it back a little bit with my tweezers and just get it off the stone. And eventually the stone will just start to fall off until I can pull the wax out, and I'll get as much of the wax off as I can by hand. And then whatever's left over, the acetone will soak off overnight. So I let the stone cool down a bit. I don't want to put a hot stone into acetone because this is a big stone, has inclusions, very potentially can break by shock. So I wait for it to cool down, and then I fill up the jar with acetone so that the whole thing is completely submerged. And I'm going to let this sit overnight, and then the next morning I get to see my reveal. So you can see that my pattern did exactly what I wanted it to do. I've got lots of light, lots of movement, lots of animation in this stone, but I have not compromised the color by making this stone too brilliant or too flashy. Morganite is very delicate. Even in a stone this big, it's very easy to lose the color. So I've tried to use a unique pattern that will really bring out the color and give it a unique look. So here we can see our whole journey. We started with a 1700 carat stone. I've sliced off the carving, I've cut off the inclusions, I've preformed it, and finally I've turned it into my finished stone. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you here next time on the Gem Cutter's Craft.